AITA for staying silent until a trustee said my signature was the one they couldn't fake? I'm Travis, 39, and Lauren and I had been married for 8 years by then. We have a 6-year-old daughter, Avery, who used to keep a glass jar of Smooth Lake rocks on her dresser because every trip to the family cabin ended with her stuffing her pockets full of them. That cabin mattered to me long before it became a legal problem. Not because I thought it was mine. It wasn't. Not because I expected some huge inheritance. I didn't. It mattered because for years, it was one of the few places where I thought Lauren's family and I could exist without all the quiet class stuff that followed us everywhere else. Lauren's mother, Cynthia, had a way of insulting people without ever saying anything that sounded insulting when repeated later. She would look around our kitchen and say, "You two have made this place very comfortable," in a tone that somehow meant I expected worse. If I fixed something at the cabin, she would say, "You're so handy." Lauren was lucky to find someone practical. If Lauren mentioned a trip we were planning, Cynthia would ask whether we were being realistic about priorities. Patrick, Lauren's father, was less polished about it. He once told me, after 2 drinks at Thanksgiving, that Lauren had always had expensive taste, then laughed and added, "No offense, Travis." I asked him what part one was supposed to take offense at. He changed the subject. Scott, Lauren's younger brother, was different. He didn't care enough to hide it. He had been the protected one for as long as I had known the family. If he made a bad decision, there was always a reason. If he lost money, somebody had misled him. If he forgot something, he was stressed. If I questioned any of it, I was keeping score. Lauren saw all of this. That's the part that took me the longest to admit. Early in our marriage, she pushed back sometimes. She would tell her mother to stop commenting on our finances. She once hung up on Patrick after he called me sensitive for objecting to a joke about my background. But over time, her resistance became quieter. Then it became private. Then it mostly disappeared. Her standard line was, "You know how they are." I told myself I was choosing peace. Looking back, I was also making it easier for everyone. Arthur, Lauren's grandfather, was the exception. He owned the cabin originally. It wasn't some mansion in the woods. It was an old 2-story place near a lake with a sloping roof, a narrow kitchen, a screened porch, a dock that needed work every spring, and back steps that always seemed one storm away from becoming firewood. Arthur didn't romanticize it. He loved it, but he also understood that old property was just a series of repairs waiting for the next person. The first summer after Lauren and I got married, he watched me replace 3 rotted dock boards while Scott stood on shore complaining about mosquitoes. Arthur brought me a bottle of water and said, "You know the problem with helping family?" I told him I assumed he was about to tell me. He nodded toward the cabin. People remember the cabin. They forget who kept it standing. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He told me to keep records whenever I spent money there. Not because you need to wave receipts around, he said. Because people forget help when money shows up. Arthur later transferred the cabin into a family trust. The trust language allowed documented maintenance contributions to be reimbursed before sale proceeds were distributed, subject to trustee review. I knew that because Arthur had sent the family a summary when he set it up. I didn't study it like a lawyer. I read enough to understand that if somebody paid legitimate expenses that preserved the property, those expenses could be documented later. For about 4 years, I covered more cabin costs than I should have. The first time was a property tax shortage. Cynthia texted me, "Trust account is temporarily short. Can you cover it for now? We'll settle up after the trust is cleaned up." I paid it from my personal account. The next year, there was an insurance premium issue. Patrick said a transfer had been delayed and asked if I could float it. I did. Then came the back steps. Then a roof patch after a bad storm. Then plumbing repairs after a freeze. Then more dock boards. Sometimes Lauren and I split the costs. Sometimes I paid because everyone else was between things. Sometimes Cynthia said she would reimburse us and never did. I kept invoices because Arthur had told me to. I kept bank records because I keep bank records. I kept texts because I almost never delete anything important. But I never sent the family a running total. I never brought a spreadsheet to Thanksgiving. I never told Scott he owed me for using the dock I repaired. That's why the later accusation that I had secretly turned the cabin into a business arrangement made me so angry. The family had no problem treating my bank account like a temporary trust fund when something broke. They only became offended by accounting when accounting applied to them. Arthur died 3 years before the dinner. After that, the cabin got stranger. Cynthia started talking about legacy more often. Patrick talked about simplifying assets. Scott started asking what the place was worth. Lauren still wanted us to go there with Avery, so we did. Avery learned to skip stones badly, which meant she threw them mostly straight down and celebrated every splash. She collected smooth gray and brown rocks from the shoreline and carried them home in her backpack. Lauren once found 12 of them in the washing machine. The jar on Avery's dresser started after that. Every time we visited, she added 2 or 3. That jar is part of why I kept helping even after I started noticing how little the family acknowledged it. I thought I was preserving something for my daughter. I thought Lauren and I were on the same side. About 2 weeks before the dinner, Lauren came into the bedroom while I was folding laundry and said her parents wanted everyone together to discuss the cabin. She called it a closure dinner. I asked what that meant. She said, "I think they're finally selling." That caught me off guard. There had been talk about selling for more than a year, but nothing concrete. I asked if a buyer had made an offer. Lauren said she didn't know all the details. Then she added, too casually, "Can you please not bring up old receipts that night?" I stopped folding a shirt. "What old receipts?" "You know? Cabin stuff." I wasn't planning to bring anything. She looked irritated. "I'm just asking you not to turn it into a reimbursement conversation." That was the first moment something felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not enough to accuse her of anything. Just wrong. I asked why she was warning me about something I hadn't mentioned. She said, "Because I know you. You'll hear sale and start thinking about what you put into it. I put money into it because your parents asked me to." I know. So why is that a problem? It's not. I just don't want the night to become tense. That phrase, tense, had become Lauren's favorite word for any situation where her family might be forced to answer an uncomfortable question. I let it go. That was still a habit then. The dinner was held at Cynthia and Patrick's house. Priya, one of Lauren's cousins, was there. So was Scott. A couple of other relatives came in and out of the conversation, mostly people who had some connection to the trust or expected distribution. Cynthia had set the table like it was a holiday. Good dishes. Cloth napkins. Wine already poured. The whole thing felt too formal for a property discussion. Lauren was tense before we even sat down. When I asked if she was okay, she said, "Please, Travis, just stand there and don't make this about you." I said, "We're sitting." She shot me a look. Then she lowered her voice. "Stay quiet tonight. They already think I'm married down." I had heard versions of that before, but never that plainly. I looked at her and said, "Do you?" She immediately glanced toward the dining room. "That's not what I said." "No, you just asked me to behave so they won't regret your choice." "Oh my God, Travis." That was when Cynthia called us in. I sat down. I didn't want to give Lauren the satisfaction of calling me dramatic. The dinner started with 10 minutes of normal conversation that felt painfully fake. Cynthia talked about Avery's school. Patrick asked Priya about her mother. Scott barely touched his food. Then Cynthia raised her glass and said she wanted to say something about the family legacy. She thanked Arthur for creating the trust. She thanked Patrick for carrying the administrative burden. She thanked Scott for helping keep everyone aligned, which almost made me choke because Scott had done exactly nothing at the cabin except occupy bedrooms and complain about cell service. Then she thanked everyone who made memories there over the years. No names. No mention of repairs. No mention of money. Lauren stared at her plate. That bothered me more than Cynthia's speech. Patrick took over. He said they had received an offer of $487,000 for the cabin and had accepted it, subject to trust review and closing conditions. Scott visibly relaxed. Not emotionally. Financially. That's the only way I can describe it. His shoulders dropped like someone had just told him a deadline was going away. Patrick said the process should be clean and simple if everyone cooperated. He used those words twice. Clean and simple. Then he said distributions could happen relatively quickly after closing. I waited. Nobody mentioned outstanding contributions. Nobody mentioned documented reimbursements. I put my fork down. Before anything is distributed, are documented maintenance costs being handled? Lauren immediately pressed her knee into mine under the table. Patrick looked at me like I had asked whether we could pawn the silverware. This is not the time to nickel and dime family. I'm asking about the trust. Cynthia smiled without warmth. The cabin was never a business arrangement, Travis. I didn't say it was. You're talking about invoices at a family dinner. I asked one question. Lauren leaned closer. Stop. I looked at her. She whispered, "You're embarrassing me." I said quietly, "I paid property taxes on that cabin." Her hand tightened around mine. "Please." That was when the front door opened. Patrick stood immediately. He said, "That'll be Eileen." I had heard the name, but hadn't met her. The previous trustee had stepped down for health reasons, and Eileen had recently taken over. She came into the dining room carrying a leather folder and 3 certified mail envelopes. Patrick walked toward her with the confident expression of someone expecting to control the introduction. Eileen looked past him. "Travis." I raised my hand slightly. She walked around Patrick and came to me. "I need to give you this directly." She handed me a sealed envelope. Patrick said, "Eileen, we can handle the paperwork after dinner." She didn't look at him. "No. This requires acknowledgement." Lauren went completely still. I noticed it because she had spent the last 5 minutes touching my knee, my hand, my sleeve, anything to keep me from talking. Now she wasn't moving at all. I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal notice stating that a reimbursement waiver and non-objection acknowledgement bearing my name had been submitted in connection with the proposed sale. The waiver said I acknowledged that I had no outstanding reimbursement claim against the trust. It also said I consented to distribution of sale proceeds without reservation. At the bottom was my name, and a signature that looked like mine if you had seen my signature twice from across a room. I stared at it. Then I looked at Eileen. "I never signed this." Patrick said immediately, "It's procedural." Eileen finally turned to him. "That's not how signatures work." Nobody spoke for a second, not because the moment was cinematic, but because everyone seemed to be trying to calculate what had just changed. I looked at Lauren. She didn't say, "What waiver?" She didn't ask to see it. She said, "Can we talk about this privately?" That was when I knew. Not everything, but enough. I looked back at the paper, then at her. "You knew this existed." "No, I knew there were forms. I didn't know what was in that exact one." "Why aren't you surprised?" "Travis, please." Cynthia jumped in. "This is exactly what I didn't want. A family issue turned into a spectacle." I said, "My name is on a document I didn't sign." Patrick waved a hand. "Nobody is trying to steal anything from you." Eileen said, "I am not here to referee a family disagreement. I am here because this signature is disputed." Scott muttered something under his breath. I asked him to repeat it. He said, "Nothing." Lauren said, "Can we just go home?" That was the first thing she said all night that made sense. I folded the notice, put it back in the envelope, and stood. Cynthia said, "So you're just leaving?" "Yes." "After causing this?" I turned to her. I didn't sign the paper. Then I looked at Lauren. "We'll talk at home." I left without shouting. That probably saved me later. If I had lost my temper, they would have made the story about my temper. At home, Lauren went straight to the kitchen. I stayed standing. She poured a glass of water and didn't drink it. Finally, she said, "I knew Dad was trying to get all the forms handled. Did you know there was a waiver with my name on it?" "I knew there was something about reimbursements." "That wasn't my question. I didn't know he was going to sign for you." That answer mattered. She didn't say, "I didn't know anyone would sign for you." She said, "I didn't know he was going to sign for you." I asked, "What did you know?" She rubbed both hands over her face. "I knew they wanted the sale clean. I knew your expenses were complicating it." "My documented expenses?" "Yes." "The ones your parents asked me to pay?" "Yes, Travis." "And what did you do?" "I told Dad you weren't going to fight the sale. You didn't ask me." "I knew you wouldn't want to blow up the whole family over $30,000 or $40,000. I stared at her. She started crying then, but I was too angry to comfort her. "Do you hear yourself?" "I thought if the sale went through, we could all move on." You mean everyone could move on with my signature buried under it? That's not fair. What part is unfair? You benefit from the sale too. That confused me. How? We're married. It affects us. Are you getting money? She hesitated. That hesitation was small, but by then I had started noticing everything. She said, not directly. What does that mean? It means my family would be more stable. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Scott. She looked away. I asked, how much trouble is he in? I don't know exactly. Try. He has debt. What kind? Credit cards. A personal loan. Maybe something else. And the cabin money fixes it. That was part of it. I asked her why she had never told me. She said, because you already judge him. I judge him for asking other people to fund his mistakes. That's exactly what I mean. No, Lauren. What you mean is that you wanted me kept outside the conversation until the money moved. She started crying harder. I was trying to protect us. From what? From this. From everyone fighting. From Mom blaming me. From Dad saying I made a mistake marrying someone who never understood how our family works. There it was. I said, and your solution was to prove them right about who gets to matter. She didn't answer. I slept in the guest room that night. The next morning, I started pulling records. Not because I had some revenge plan. Because for the first time in 8 years, I didn't trust my wife's version of what had happened. I downloaded bank statements. I searched old messages. I found the property tax payment from my personal account. Then the second one. I found the insurance transfer. I found invoices for the back steps, the storm roof patch, plumbing, dock boards, and a smaller electrical repair I had forgotten about. I found a text from Cynthia that said, "We will settle up after the trust is cleaned up." I found another where she wrote, "Can you cover insurance through Friday? Patrick is moving money." I made a simple list. By lunchtime, I was at $38,740. I was still missing a couple of smaller charges. Lauren came into the room twice. The first time she asked what I was doing. I told her. The second time she said, "This looks like you're building a case against my family." I said, "Someone put my signature on a legal document." She said, "You keep saying legal as if we're strangers. That's exactly what makes this worse." She left. That afternoon, Patrick called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. "Travis, this has gotten blown out of proportion. The waiver was procedural. It was meant to keep the closing clean. Nobody was trying to deprive you of anything. Call me before you make this worse." I saved it. Then I went through our shared household email account. Lauren and I used it for school notices, utilities, insurance, travel confirmations, and family paperwork. Both of us had access. I searched Eileen's name. Nothing. I searched trustee. Nothing. Then I checked deleted items. Most of it was junk. I restored a few emails. One subject line was, "Confirmation of maintenance reimbursement claim." Another was, "Second notice, response requested." Both had originally been sent to the household account. Both had been forwarded to Patrick. I opened the forwarding details. Lauren had forwarded them. Then the original emails had been deleted. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. That hurt more than the forged signature. I expected Cynthia and Patrick to minimize me. I expected Scott to resent anything that reduced his payout. I didn't expect my wife to intercept communication addressed to both of us, send it to her father, and remove it from an account we shared. The first notice had asked me to confirm whether I intended to submit documented expenses. The second warned that a waiver had been received, but required verification. Lauren had never shown me either one. When she came home later, I had printed them. I put the pages on the kitchen counter. She looked at them and went pale. She sat down. "I thought Dad was handling it. You forwarded these." "Yes." "And deleted them." "I didn't want you reacting before I knew what they meant. They were addressed to me." "I know." "No." "You knew." She started crying again. I was beginning to realize tears could be sincere and still not change the facts. She said, "I thought the sale money would fix everything." "What is everything?" "My parents are under pressure. Scott is under pressure. Everybody has been fighting about that cabin for 2 years. Dad said once it sold, things would settle down. And you believe the way to settle things down was to make sure I never saw a notice with my name on it. I didn't know they would forge your signature. I believe that part. I still do. I don't think Lauren sat down with Patrick and planned a forgery, but she knew I had a claim. She knew the trustee was contacting me. She knew her father wanted the sale to proceed without me objecting, and she chose to hide the communications because she thought my silence was useful. That was enough. The next morning, I wrote Eileen. I kept it simple. I disputed the waiver. I stated that I had not signed it and had not authorized anyone to sign for me. I stated that I had documented maintenance contributions and intended to submit them for review. I asked that no distribution be made based on any purported waiver bearing my name. I attached the notice she had given me and requested instructions for submitting evidence. Eileen replied that afternoon. She didn't promise anything. She said the sale could not proceed to clean distribution while the waiver and reimbursement issue were disputed, and that the trust would begin a formal review. I sent bank records, invoices, text messages, the forwarded notices, and Patrick's voicemail. Then I stopped paying anything connected to the cabin. 2 days later, the insurance payment reminder came through. Lauren asked if I was going to handle it. I looked at her. No. She said, it still needs to be paid. Then the trust can pay it. Mom said the account is tight. I'm not the account. That was the first practical boundary I set. It was also when Lauren seemed to understand that things had actually changed. Scott called me that night. I almost didn't answer, but I wanted to hear what he would say. He skipped hello. You picked the worst possible time to get righteous. I said, interesting word. You have no idea what your timing just cost me. That sounds like something you should discuss with your parents. The payout was supposed to happen next month. Supposed to. I already made arrangements. With money you didn't have. He cursed. I said no. You built a plan on money that wasn't cleared. This is family money. Then why was my name on the waiver? Silence. Then he said, you always wanted to prove you were better than us. I said, I wanted my signature left alone. He hung up. Over the next week, the calls started. Not dozens. Not some absurd mob. Just enough. An aunt I barely knew sent Lauren a message saying I was holding the cabin hostage. Priya texted me and said she had heard I was demanding a huge cut of the sale. I answered, I'm asking the trustee to review documented expenses and a waiver I didn't sign. She replied, Cynthia says you agreed years ago that the money was a gift. I sent back, then she should have no problem showing where I said that. Priya didn't answer. Lauren and I were barely functioning. We still had Avery, which meant breakfast had to happen, school pickup had to happen, bath time had to happen. That made the whole thing worse in a way I hadn't expected. You can be furious with your spouse and still stand beside them packing a child's lunch. You can wonder whether your marriage is over while rinsing toothpaste out of a sink. You can hear your wife whisper to her mother in the hallway, then 10 minutes later help your daughter find a missing sock. Lauren moved into the guest room. At first, she said it was temporary because neither of us was sleeping. Then it became obvious she was avoiding me. Avery noticed. She asked one evening, is Mom mad because of the lake house? We never called it the lake house before. That was Cynthia's phrase. Avery had probably heard it on speakerphone. I said, the adults are figuring out some things. Are we still going? Not for a while. She looked toward her dresser. At the jar. Can I keep the rocks? That question landed harder than any insult from Cynthia. Of course. She nodded and went back to coloring. A few days later, Priya called me. She sounded uncomfortable. She said, can I ask you something without you jumping on me? I'll try. Did Cynthia actually text you asking you to cover taxes? Yes. And insurance? Yes. How much did you pay total? I've documented a little over $40,000. She was quiet. Then she said, that's not the version I heard. I figured. What version did you hear? That you did a few repairs because you liked doing projects and now you're trying to turn them into ownership. I'm not claiming ownership. I know that now. I asked what changed. She said she had asked Cynthia whether there was actually a disputed signature. Cynthia told her it was a technical misunderstanding. That wording bothered Priya enough that she started asking more questions. She said, "I'm not taking sides. I just think if your signature is on something, that should be answerable. Fair." Then she said something I remembered later. "Cynthia is planning another family meeting." I laughed. Of course she is. She thinks if everyone is in one room, this can be resolved privately. Tell her no. I already told her to ask you. The invitation came from Lauren. She stood in the kitchen and said, "My parents want everyone to meet Sunday." No. Travis. No private cleanup. Can you hear me out? I've been hearing everyone out for years. She flinched. I regretted the tone, but not the answer. She said, "Eileen won't be there. This is just family. That's the problem. Please." I asked her one question. If your mother starts telling everyone I'm greedy, are you going to correct her? Lauren didn't answer. That told me enough. I said I would go under two conditions. First, nobody would ask me to sign anything. Second, if the trust issue came up, I would discuss the actual documents, not Cynthia's interpretation of them. Lauren agreed. The meeting was at Cynthia and Patrick's house again. This time there was no formal dinner. Coffee, sandwiches, people sitting in different rooms. It felt less like a family gathering and more like everyone wanted plausible deniability later. Priya was there. Scott was there. Two other relatives were present. Lauren sat beside me at first, then moved across the room after her mother asked her to help with something and never came back to my side. Cynthia opened with a speech about healing. Then she said she was concerned that financial misunderstandings were tearing the family apart. I listened. Patrick said the sale was at risk because the buyer's attorney wouldn't proceed while trust distributions were disputed. That was new information. I asked whether the buyer had backed out. Patrick said, "Not yet." Scott said, "But they will if this drags." I said, "Then resolve it properly." Cynthia looked at me. "This is what I mean. You talk as though we're adversaries." My signature was used without permission. She exhaled like I was being exhausting. The cabin was never a business arrangement until you decided to act like a creditor. I said, "You asked me to pay taxes. For the family. You said you'd settle up. We all say things informally. Then let's look at what was said." I had brought a folder. Not a giant presentation. Not charts. Just copies. I started with the payments. That mattered. I didn't start with the forgery because I wanted everyone to understand the context first. I showed the property tax transfer. Patrick said, "You volunteered." I showed Cynthia's text asking me to cover it. She said, "That doesn't mean reimbursement." I showed the follow-up where she wrote, "We will settle up after the trust is cleaned up." Scott rolled his eyes. Cynthia said, "Settle up can mean many things." Priya said, "It usually means settle up." Cynthia ignored her. I showed the insurance payments. Then the repair invoices. Back steps. Roof patch. Plumbing. Dock boards. Electrical. A second property tax contribution. Avery had scribbled a purple line on one old printed invoice years earlier. I had almost left that page out because it felt too personal. I left it in. Patrick said, "Nobody forced you to spend that money." I said, "Nobody forced you to accept it either." Then I showed the relevant trust language Arthur had included about documented maintenance contributions being reviewed before distribution. Patrick called it technical. I said, "It is the trust." He said, "Arthur included broad language because he didn't want people fighting over small expenses. $40,000 is not small." Scott said, "Compared to the property value, it is." I looked at him. "Then you shouldn't care if it gets reviewed." He stopped talking. Only then did I take out the waiver. I placed a copy on the coffee table that says I gave up reimbursement and agreed not to contest distribution. Cynthia said, "We know what it says." I didn't sign it. Patrick said, "Nobody is disputing that the signature was handled incorrectly." That wording made several people look at him. Not me. Him. I said, "Handled incorrectly?" He leaned forward. "It was meant to keep things moving. Nobody was trying to hurt you. You were trying to remove me without asking me. That's dramatic." "No. Dramatic is a family meeting about why I should ignore a forged signature. Cynthia cut in. Stop using that word. What word? Forged. What would you prefer? She didn't answer. Priya said, is the signature his or not? Patrick said, that's not the point. Priya looked at Cynthia. Is he lying about the payments? Or do you just not like that he kept records? Cynthia's face changed. Not much. But enough. She said, you have known Travis for years. You know how defensive he can be. Priya said, that's not an answer. Nobody cheered. Nobody suddenly became my ally. Scott looked furious. One relative stared at the floor. Lauren was crying quietly across the room. Patrick kept his arms folded. But the room had changed because Cynthia could no longer talk about me as though there were no documents. I took out the printed email notices. Lauren saw them before anyone else did. I watched her realize what was coming. I said, these were sent to our household email. I passed one to Priya. They asked me to confirm my reimbursement claim. Then I passed the second. This one said a waiver had been submitted and needed verification. Patrick said, we've already covered this. No. We haven't. I looked at Lauren. Not your parents. You. Did you forward these to your father? She was silent. I asked again. Did you send them? Lauren wiped her face. Yes. Cynthia said, Lauren, you don't have to answer him like you're being interrogated. I ignored Cynthia. I asked, did you delete them after? Lauren nodded. Priya looked at her. Why? Lauren said, I thought I was protecting us. I said, you were protecting them from me. She said, I didn't know Dad would sign your name. I believe you. That surprised her. I continued, but you knew the trustee was trying to reach me. Yes. You knew they were asking about my claim. Yes. You knew your father wanted the sale to move without me objecting. She looked at Patrick. Then back at me. Yes. I nodded. That is enough. She started crying harder. I was scared. I know. My parents kept saying the sale had to happen. Scott was in trouble. Dad said the buyer could walk. Mom said if this fell apart, everyone would blame me because you were my husband. And you chose who you were willing to betray. That's not what I thought I was doing. I know. That was the worst part. I believed her. I believed she had convinced herself she was preventing conflict. I believed she had told herself I would eventually understand. I believed she thought deleting those emails was temporary. None of that made it okay. Patrick stood. This has gone far enough. I said, agreed. He pointed at my folder. You came here to humiliate this family. I came because Cynthia told people I invented a claim after money appeared. Cynthia said, you did wait until the sale. I asked at the first dinner. Before I knew about the forged waiver. She said, you always kept those receipts. Arthur told me to. That shut Patrick up for a moment. Arthur's name carried weight in that room that mine never had. I stood. I'm not signing the waiver. I'm not withdrawing my claim. I'm not discussing trust paperwork privately anymore. If there is something about the sale, it goes through Eileen. Cynthia said, you are making this impossible. No, I'm making it documented. Scott laughed bitterly. So this is revenge. I looked at him. Revenge would be trying to take something that isn't mine. I'm trying to stop you from using something that is. He said, you know what this is doing to me. Yes. You don't care. I care that you planned around money before the trust was cleared. That doesn't make your debt my responsibility. Lauren followed me outside. She said, you didn't have to do that in front of everyone. I turned around. Your mother invited everyone because she thought numbers would embarrass me. You could have pulled me aside. I tried private for 8 years. That's not fair. Then tell me what was fair about deleting my mail. She had no answer. The buyer paused the transaction the following week. Not because of some huge courtroom showdown. Because the trustee couldn't certify clean distribution while the claim and disputed waiver were under review. A few weeks later, the buyer withdrew. Patrick blamed me. Scott definitely blamed me. Cynthia told people I had destroyed the sale. Eileen's wording was much less emotional. She said the trust was free to seek another buyer after the review issues were resolved. That was the difference between family language and reality. Family language said I had destroyed something. Reality said paperwork had to be corrected before hundreds of thousands of dollars moved. The review took almost 3 months. During that time, Eileen asked for additional documentation, including proof that certain repairs were necessary and not cosmetic. I provided photos, old texts, invoices, a contractor email. Not everything was accepted. One repair didn't qualify because it had improved the dock beyond basic maintenance. Another smaller expense couldn't be tied clearly enough to the cabin. The final approved reimbursement was $36,280, less than I had submitted. More than my in-laws wanted to admit. The trustee also formally rejected the disputed waiver. Eileen didn't accuse Patrick of a crime in any letter I saw. She simply documented that I denied signing it, that there was no valid authorization, and that it could not be relied upon. That was enough for me. Patrick stopped leaving voicemails. Everything came by email after that. The trust eventually accepted another offer for slightly less than the first one. By then, the reimbursement issue had been resolved and the distribution language corrected. Scott still got money. Just later than he expected and less than he had planned around. He told Lauren I had cost him a chance to get ahead. I told her not to relay those messages to me anymore. Cynthia never apologized. She sent one carefully worded text saying she regretted how the process unfolded. I replied, "Please keep trust matters with Eileen." That was the entire exchange. Priya called me once after the review finished. She said, "For what it's worth, I was wrong at first." I said, "I know." She laughed a little. Then she said, "I'm sorry." That was enough. The marriage was harder. Much harder. Lauren moved out temporarily about a month after the second family meeting. She said she couldn't live in a house where every conversation felt like evidence. I told her I couldn't live in a marriage where evidence was the only reason I knew the truth. That hurt her. It hurt me too. We set a temporary schedule with Avery and kept the adult details away from her as much as possible. There was no dramatic custody battle. No screaming handoffs. Just two people trying not to let their daughter absorb the consequences of something she had nothing to do with. One night before Lauren moved the last of her clothes out, Avery stood in her bedroom, holding the jar of lake rocks. She asked, "Should these go with Mom?" I said, "Why?" "Because they're from her family's cabin." I sat on the edge of her bed. "They're your rocks. Even if we don't go there?" "Even then." She thought about that. Then she put the jar in a cardboard box with a few stuffed animals. Later, after she fell asleep, I took the jar back out and set it on her dresser. I didn't want the adults' mess deciding what memories she was allowed to keep. Lauren saw it the next morning. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry." I asked for what. She looked at me like the answer was too big to fit into one sentence. "For making you the problem because I was scared of them." That was the first apology that reached the actual issue. I didn't tell her everything was okay. It wasn't. She asked if I would consider counseling. I said yes, with conditions. Full transparency. No shared financial obligations connected to her family without written agreement. No forwarding, deleting, signing, or handling anything in my name. No expectation that I would keep quiet to protect Cynthia or Patrick from embarrassment. And if there was ever another situation where she had to choose between telling me the truth and keeping her parents calm, I needed her to understand that choosing them might end the marriage. Lauren agreed. Agreement is not trust, though. We started counseling while living separately. I still don't know whether the marriage survives long term. Some days I think it might. Some days I remember her sitting at that dinner, already knowing there were forms involving me, squeezing my hand under the table so I wouldn't ask questions. That image is difficult to get past. The reimbursement money went into an account I control. It wasn't life-changing money. It didn't feel like a victory. Part of it covered things we had put off because so much cash had gone into the cabin over the years. Part stayed untouched. I never celebrated the sale. I never drove past Cynthia's house smiling. I never told Scott he deserved what happened. Mostly, I was tired. For years, I thought being steady meant absorbing things other people didn't want to deal with. The jokes. The comments. The unpaid expenses. The little exclusions. Lauren asking me not to react. Cynthia telling me not to keep score. Patrick telling me paperwork was only paperwork when the paperwork helped him. I kept assuming that if I stayed useful long enough, eventually they would stop seeing me as someone Lauren had brought in from outside. What I finally understood was that usefulness was the condition. As long as I paid, fixed, drove, covered, and stayed quiet, I was welcome enough. The moment I asked why my name was on something I didn't sign, I became greedy. Avery still has the rocks. The cabin belongs to somebody else now. She asks about it less often. A few weeks ago, she brought home a smooth stone from a park and dropped it into the same jar. I asked what that one was from. She said, now it's not just cabin rocks. I told her I liked that. Lauren and I are still in counseling. Her parents are not part of our finances. Trust communication is finished. Scott still won't speak to me. Cynthia is polite in the exact way people are polite when they want to avoid admitting anything. Patrick stays out of my way. And I don't know whether refusing to sign, freezing the sale, and exposing Lauren's part in hiding the trustee notices makes me vindictive or simply late in protecting myself. But I do know this. I was invited to that table for years. I just wasn't allowed to have a voice at it until they needed my signature. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.